It begins like any ordinary day in an upscale New York suburb, the kind of place where neighbors wave politely while driving past manicured lawns and expensive cars glisten in the driveways. On the surface, it was the perfect picture of comfort and success. Behind the doors of one stately house, however, was a family drama that would soon explode into one of the most shocking and disturbing murder cases this community had ever seen. A wealthy businessman, admired for his success and status, would be found dead in his own home, killed in the most brutal and personal way imaginable. His face was obliterated by a shotgun blast. His killer didn't slip in from the shadows or creep through the window. According to the confession given that night, the shooter was no stranger at all. The suspect was his own flesh and blood, his 20-year-old son, an Ivy League student with what seemed like a bright future ahead of him. But as investigators quickly learned, nothing about this case would be as simple as it appeared. From the very beginning, the story gripped the public. A son who appeared to have everything: prestige, education, talent, now accused of one of the most unthinkable crimes, patricide. How could a child who seemed to embody success turn into a confessed killer? And just as shocking, once the police began piecing together the timeline and the evidence, it started to look like maybe things weren't exactly as they first seemed. The case would unravel with twists and contradictions, courtroom drama, and forensic puzzles that cast doubt on the truth. Was this really a young man who snapped under pressure and finally lashed out against an abusive father? Or was the confession hiding a much darker, more complicated truth about what went on inside that home? The man at the center of it all was Jim Tan, a self-made businessman who had built his wealth through digital imaging technology. By all outward appearances, he was living the dream. He had a beautiful house, a wife named Jean, and 2 sons who were excelling in school. To the outside world, the family looked like the perfect American success story. But perfection, as it so often does, masked pain. Behind closed doors, there were whispers of a home ruled by fear, a marriage scarred by years of emotional and physical abuse, and a household where police had been called more times than anyone cared to admit. Neighbors would later recall seeing Jean sometimes with unexplained injuries, a bruise here, a mark there, the kind that suggested a hidden violence. The truth was ugly, but largely invisible. Charlie Tan, the younger son, was in many ways the golden child. At Cornell University, he was a star student and a standout athlete, someone his peers admired. He smiled easily, worked hard, and seemed to embody the promise of youth. Teachers, coaches, and friends described him as bright, disciplined, and loyal to his family. Nothing in his demeanor suggested the kind of rage or darkness that could lead to murder. But everything would change in February of 2015. That winter, Charlie suddenly left Cornell and returned home without much explanation. He told his coach he needed to go back, but didn't say why. 4 days later, his mother dialed 911. Her voice, frantic yet oddly steady, reported that there had been a terrible incident in the house. When police arrived, Charlie met them at the door and calmly directed them to where his father's body could be found. He admitted what he claimed had happened, his words shocking in their simplicity: "I had to do it. I did it. He was going to hurt my mom." It sounded like a confession of self-defense, a desperate act to protect his mother from years of violence. But once investigators stepped inside the house, they realized something about the scene didn't quite line up. Jim Tan's body was found in his study. He was slumped over his desk, his face destroyed by a close-range blast from a shotgun. There were other wounds too, one to the chest, another to the arm. The weapon itself lay nearby. At first glance, it looked like a straightforward case. The son had confessed, the gun was there, the victim was dead. But then came the smell, that unmistakable odor of decomposition. To trained investigators, it raised an immediate red flag. The body smelled older than a day. The coroner's examination would confirm those suspicions. Based on the condition of the remains, blood pooling, and rigor mortis, it appeared that Jim Tan had been dead not for hours, but for days. In fact, the estimate was that he had been killed as much as 3 days earlier, possibly the very same day Charlie came home from Cornell. That meant something troubling. The 911 call Jean made was not a reaction to a fresh act of violence. It was a call made long after the fact, perhaps staged, perhaps delayed for reasons no one could yet understand. And the questions didn't stop there. When detectives searched Jim's computer, they found his usual work emails and online activities stopped abruptly 4 days earlier. He hadn't logged in, responded, or shown any signs of life since the day Charlie left school. To the coroner and investigators, that timeline made more sense. But if Jim was killed on Thursday, why did Jean wait until Monday night to call 911? And why had Charlie told police he had to do it, in the moment, as if it had just happened? Meanwhile, surveillance footage painted another part of the story. Just before leaving Cornell, Charlie had walked into a gun shop and attempted to buy a shotgun. Because of his age and restrictions, he was denied. But the cameras showed something else. One of Charlie's friends returned later and successfully purchased the shotgun for him. That was the very weapon later found beside his father's body. It seemed to suggest premeditation, a plan carried out days before the supposed act of self-defense. Yet even this detail didn't tie things up neatly. Forensic testing on the shotgun itself revealed 3 separate DNA profiles, none of which matched Charlie. His fingerprints weren't found on the weapon either. The only forensic connection came from fingerprints found on spent shotgun shells. The defense would later argue that those prints could have been placed there at any time, even days earlier, when Charlie may have handled the ammunition. It wasn't the kind of direct physical evidence that screamed guilt. In fact, to many, it screamed the opposite. If he had pulled the trigger, why wasn't his DNA on the gun? And then there was the email. Just before leaving Cornell, Charlie had sent a cryptic message to some of his closest friends. The subject line read, "Showtime." In the body, he warned them not to believe what they were about to hear in the news. It was chilling in hindsight, as if he knew something terrible was coming. The prosecution would later argue this was evidence of intent, proof that Charlie was preparing himself, and his friends, for the storm about to hit. But the defense countered with another interpretation. What if Charlie knew his mother was planning something? What if his words were an attempt to prepare friends for a scandal that would not directly involve him? When the trial began, the courtroom overflowed with reporters, family friends, and strangers who simply wanted to see how this drama would play out. On one side, prosecutors pointed to the confession, the shotgun purchase, the cryptic email, and the son's return home as proof of guilt. On the other, the defense highlighted the glaring holes, a suspicious timeline, a body dead for days before the call, no DNA or fingerprints on the gun, and a mother who may have orchestrated a cover-up. It was a trial of evidence versus narrative, facts versus interpretation. Jurors listened intently, deliberated for 5 long days, but in the end, they couldn't agree. The jury was hopelessly deadlocked. The judge declared a mistrial. In most cases, that would mean a new trial, another chance for prosecutors to present their case. But here, something extraordinary happened. The judge reviewed the evidence once more and ruled that there was not enough to proceed to a second trial. The charges were dismissed. Just like that, the case collapsed. Public reaction was explosive. Some saw Charlie as a protective son who saved his mother from years of abuse. Others saw him as a privileged young man who got away with murder thanks to good lawyers and shaky evidence. And then there were those who believed the truth was even darker, that Jean Tan herself had pulled the trigger, and that her son's so-called confession was nothing more than a desperate attempt to protect her.